This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Again, I would like to clarify my intentions. I am not here to attack SDTC or its workers or the companies that it funds. SDTC plays a critical role in the Canadian economy. I genuinely believe in its mandate, and I can personally attest to how effective the organization is at utilizing taxpayer money to create jobs and develop new industries. The organization needs to survive, and the employees working there need to be protected, because empowering those SDTC employees is crucial for the successful delivery of its mandate. And the only way to get SDTC back on track is to discuss the facts and set the record straight. I believe that accountability is the cornerstone of a just society, and that's the sole purpose of my presence here. The SDTC board, executives, and senior management must be held accountable for their gross mismanagement of taxpayer money and the gross misconduct that's been perpetrated by the toxic senior management team that has victimized countless employees. And the federal government must also be held accountable for its embarrassing lack of oversight that's allowed these problems to persist, and its egregious cover-up of the truth that occurred this fall. At the beginning of this year, a comprehensive 345-page presentation was created and submitted to the Privy Council office at the request of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, who we originally went to. This package contained documents that outline gross mismanagement across every aspect of SDTC's operations and governance. It highlighted non-compliance with the SDTC Act and Contribution Agreement across all of the organization's funding streams and serious breaches of the conflict of interest policies by the executives and board. The package also included evidence of the toxic workplace culture that was created by CEO Leah Lawrence and her friend and still current VP Zoe Kolbuck, who've been allowed to continue abusing and harassing employees by a passive senior management team and board that protects and hides the abuse. All of this information underwent review by PCO and was then forwarded to ISED, who subsequently engaged RCGT to conduct an independent fact-finding exercise to validate this information. Here are the findings for everyone. The Seed Fund, Ecosystem Fund, and Scale Up Fund were all found to be ineligible due to multiple violations of the contribution agreement, significant deviations from the due diligence process, and conflict of interest breaches by board members and executives. This finding encompasses nearly 200 companies that all received over $80 million, all of which was improperly funded using taxpayer money. The two COVID payments in 2020 and 2021 were also given to the full portfolio of companies and totaled almost $40 million, and were also deemed to be ineligible as the use of these funds was not effectively tracked. And several board members in that instance also violated conflict of interest by approving almost $4 million to themselves to over a dozen companies where they all hold significant ownership or executive positions. The report also revealed that SDTC lacked HR processes or policies, and issues were never even reported to the board. And conveniently, the RCGT investigators couldn't even find a single record of any complaint ever being made in the history of the organization. This is a staggering level of incompetence, willful ignorance, and corruption that has resulted in SDTC improperly distributing almost $150 million in taxpayer dollars just in the past few years, and abusing dozens of people that have only tried to talk about the truth. The organization deserved to be suspended. The organization also deserved a new board, executive, and senior management team, but that never happened. Not a single one of the individuals responsible for these issues has faced a single consequence. No executive or board member was terminated or even given the slightest handcuffs. And every single person that was directly implicated even had their names redacted and protected by ISED in the RCGT report. Even more shocking is the fact that despite these findings, ISED continues to allow these individuals to manage taxpayer dollars and allows them to continue perpetuating the abuse against employees who've been desperately seeking protection from their own government for over a year. That cannot stand. SDTC's board and executive continues to insist that the issues are just minor inconsistencies, while ISED and the minister continue to claim that no findings warrant serious action. These are false narratives, and I'm here to provide documented proof of all of the lies that continue to be perpetuated by both SDTC and ISED. I believe that my testimony can provide an in-depth overview of the key issues at SDTC because I worked on the financial due diligence and compliance of projects at SDTC for the key 2-year period that coincides with the most serious findings in the RCGT report. I am also intimately aware of exactly how ISED understood the issues and the clear direction that the total bureaucracy had laid out. The minister and PCO have been aware of this file for more than they are telling to the public, and there are even documented evidence that they even engaged with everyone at ISED to make sure there were edits to the briefings before they were officially sent to them. All of this is backed up by documents, transcripts, and recordings, some of which we've already submitted to this committee. Thank you, and I welcome all your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. And to start the discussion, I'll turn to MP Barrett.
Sir, I have 6 minutes, and so I'll ask you a question, and I'll give you up to a minute to respond to each. So I'll try and do this in 6 questions if I can. Can you confirm that in your opening statement that you've said that up to 150 million taxpayer dollars have been misappropriated in your estimation?
Correct.
How many board members and executives are in conflicts of interest and are funding companies that they have a financial interest in?
At least half of them.
Are you able to provide some examples to the committee?
I think key examples would include ex-CEO and ex-chair Annette Verschuren and Leah Lawrence. I think what they've said before is not the full truth because Annette Verschuren said that she had never applied for anything at SDTC, but she in fact applied to SDTC for her Verschuren Center in 2021 and tried to get funding for that organization, which was ultimately rejected.
Sir, you mentioned that you have documented proof of the things that you've said. Is there any information that you have not submitted to the committee that you would be able to provide to the committee specifically with respect to your testimony today?
We are willing to provide all the information under the condition that it's also publicly released.
Okay, so you'll be able to forward that to the clerk?
Yeah.
The conflicts of interest that we've seen that have been identified as with respect to appointees of the Liberal government that have totaled more than $600,000 with respect to, specifically with respect to COVID payments with Ms. Verschuren and Mr. Ouimet. These are not isolated incidents with respect to those COVID payments. Is that correct?
That's correct. When we're talking about the COVID payments, what we need to talk about is that there were 2 payments that were made. And the findings of the RCGT report don't just say that the conflict of interest rules were broken. What they've also found is that all of the $40 million that was given out was not even effectively tracked because anything that's funded by SDTC has to be tracked for eligible funding, and none of that happened for both payments, which was founded by the RCGT report.
Well, how much money flowed to the companies that are in conflict of interest?
For both of those payments, it would be almost $2 million each time to likely a dozen companies or more. It's hard for us to really know because we were not really made aware of all the conflicts of the board members at most of the time.
So you just heard testimony from ISED officials, the deputy minister. To your knowledge, in their opening statement or in response to questions from members of this committee, did they mislead or fail to provide fulsome answers?
They did.
Can you provide the details of that assessment?
So, with regards to the ISED situation, ISED representatives were open and transparent about the investigation from day one and provided weekly debriefs on the progress. There was no coercion in any of this. And here are the real facts of the matter. ISED representatives have spoken multiple occasions that there were no briefings made to PCO regarding the situation. This is a lie because we have evidence that the Deputy Minister and ADM were in continuous conversations with PCO because the investigation included GIC appointees. The Minister has spoken on the record multiple times that he was only briefed on the outcome on August 27th, but that's definitively not true, and he has lied at the Ethics Committee. The Deputy Minister spoke to the Minister's office and the Minister on several occasions before the briefings were finalized, including edits that were made on behalf of the Minister's office. The real truth of the matter is there was a definitive consensus across the bureaucracy at both ISED and PCO, and the full board and executive team at SDTC needed to be terminated. This was described to us in detail and on multiple occasions in late August and September. The outcome of this situation only changed when the Minister's office became involved, and he is ultimately responsible for SDTC, and he's the one that needs to tell the truth about what the real situation is. With regards to some of this, we have already submitted clips and transcripts from September 1st and September 29th that provide all of the detailed information, and if I have some time, I'd like to just go over some of that.
Okay, I've got 60 seconds left,
enough.
so go ahead, sir.
On August 25th, this is what was said. The overall thematic is kind of where we've come to sort of understand as well, which is that there's a lot of sloppiness and laziness, and there's some outright incompetence, and the situation is untenable at this point, and that doesn't even include any of the allegations related to the way in which the place is managed. Just on the basis of the administration of the agreement, the governance, the conflict of interest, and shoddy management of the COI, the situation is untenable. On September 1st, the report implicates the board in terrible ways by not following process, not following COI regime, and not being prudent fiduciaries. They've missed out on so many issues. It's a board failure altogether, and this is how we're briefing it. This is how it's well understood by us and the deputies, and I think it's understood by PCO as well because it's not the first time they've seen this kind of situation. And the final one is in September 29th. Since we've last spoke, most of the week for us has been involved in finalizing the briefing to the Minister. Obviously, there's been verbal debriefs from the Minister to the Chief of Staff and the Minister himself, just so he gets a heads up on what's coming, and that's resulted in tweaking to the briefing packages and all that stuff.
Thank you very much. MP Sorbara, the floor is yours.
My question is, first of all, in terms of the internal process at SDTC that you were able to follow or able to pursue, can you speak about that? How the issues were handled internally, when how you raised them, and what was the reception, and so forth?
Is this related to HR complaints or related to the funding?
Both tangents, if you may.
Yeah. With regards to HR policies, it's not just that there was massive turnover at the employee level. Within a 2-year period, every single HR director, which is almost 4, were either fired or they went on stress leave. So even when complaints were being made, the employees that were then tasked with dealing with them, if they actually took it seriously, every single one of them would be pushed out or fired. And every single one of them was put under an NDA, which specifically had language that prevented them from even going to the federal government to complain about the issues that were ongoing. So as it relates to the organization as a whole, the culture of fear is there and it's existed for a long time. And even when people have the strength and courage to take those issues to someone, every single time it's been hammered down because of people like Leah Lawrence, Zoe Kolbach, and the whole organization as the top senior level management. With regards to the funding issues, all of the issues that were found by RCGT were noted by employees on multiple occasions. There are emails we can provide where we and others also had issues that were sent to executives and even to the CEO. An example of that would be the Verscheren Center application, and that's related to the ecosystem fund. So the ecosystem fund, which has been found by RCGT to not be in any way eligible, was approved by the board without any consultation with ISED. And when it was approved by the board themselves, the first project, the second project, and the third project, all of them were related to board members and had conflicts. The second one specifically was the Verschuren Center application, and employees complained multiple times, even on email, to executives complaining that this is an obvious conflict of interest, yet not a single one of those issues was heard by executives, and we were continually ignored up until it went to the board, and other board members finally admitted that this was an obvious conflict of interest. And even after it was rejected, the executives then forced employees to use SDTC's reputation to personally go to other federal or provincial funding organizations at which they could then use SDTC's reputation and see whether they would be willing to give the Verschuren Center funding. So even when something doesn't get approved, there's still employee pressure from the executive team to make sure some of these things happen.
Just for not for clarification, but just to put it on the record, when you mentioned the word NDAs, you were talking about non-disclosure agreements?
Correct.
Okay. Do I have any further time? Okay. And my second question is, you did obviously, it sounds like yourself and many other folks did raise issues. When would you say, or how long would you say it took for either the board members or for internal processes to kick in where these concerns were listened to or heard and accepted that they were serious from your point of view?
They were never taken seriously, and they were always swept under the rug.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. First, I'd like to know what motivated you to come and testify here before us today.
Accountability.
And could you tell us to what extent or how it is that you're a credible witness? Why should we believe your testimony and evidence here today?
Because I'm not a disgruntled employee. I left SDTC on my own accord, and I'm one of the rare few employees that wasn't fired or given an NDA. So I can also provide evidence and documentation that even when I provided my resignation, I was offered a promotion and more money to stay at SDTC because throughout the 2 years I was there, I was a high performer. I received all of that in writing, and I can also provide it. So I also worked on every single one of these funds, whether it's the Seed Fund, Ecosystem Fund, Scale Fund, or the regular tech fund. So being on the financial side, I got to see every single aspect of these projects, and more importantly, it's on the financial compliance because we know exactly what the rules are because we are dealing with the rules here, and we could see where the deviations are, whether they're slight or major. So that's why I believe I'm a credible witness, because as an employee, I'm not a disgruntled employee like SDTC continues to state around other people, and I'm not under an NDA, so I chose to come here out of my own choice with taking all of those risks.
Dans vos remarques préliminaires.
In your opening remarks and in the responses that you've given thus far, you often have used the expression we. Who does that we amount to?
That includes current and former employees. This would be, between 20 and 30, both half on the inside and on the outside. Because, again, the majority of ex-employees, none of which were ever fired for cause, every single one of them was given a package and the stipulation that for you to receive the package you have to sign these NDAs. On the inside, you can clearly see that there's a major culture of fear that still persists because just because the CEO is gone, that doesn't mean that all of her friends that she's hired in the executive seats, like Zoe Kolbach or Stephen Engel, or all of the other passive bystanders that continue to perpetuate these issues, all of them still exist. So it's very hard to have a lot of people willing to come to these situations.
Based on an article from Radio-Canada 1st of November, there's a whistleblower that expressed the feeling that the government made a number of unkept promises and tried to minimize the ramifications of your complaint. So could you please further elaborate on what those unkept promises this article refers to are?
I think the most major one has to be the protection of employees. The minister stated that as soon as this report was completed, they started this HR investigation. That's a lie. Since day one, we made sure that the HR issues were noted because that's the most important aspect of the investigation. How can you properly investigate when employees aren't being protected on the inside? So they've known about the culture issues from day one, and those were proven to them even in May. Now, the most egregious thing that happened during ISED's investigation has to be that in September, while they were still investigating, another employee was fired by Leah Lawrence, and nothing was done to protect this employee. And this is during the ISED investigation, and ISED was unwilling to stand up and stop this. This employee was put under the same sort of NDA that every other employee has had to deal with. So ISED knew about this, and they were unwilling to do anything to protect employees, just like they're doing now, because even the McCarthy-Tetro investigation that they've started has already broken confidentiality, because every single person that signs up for it, all of their names are shown to SDTC executives, and they can list off everyone that's taking this. So the whole HR investigation has been a farce. On the other side, what we asked was not for everyone to be fired. We asked for proper investigation, and when all of this was founded in May, it was then suddenly changed. You know, the continued changing of the goalposts happened throughout this investigation, and the key issue is that because no one was protected, this has continued to lapse.
Dernière petite question.
Final quick question. How do you assess the efficiency of the whistleblowers program and mechanisms that were put in place? Does the mechanism need to be tweaked in any way? And as a subtext here, I would say there's also a lack of trust and confidence. How would one best restore the lack of confidence between the government and stakeholders?
Well, with regards to our experience in the whole situation, I think it's frankly embarrassing. And the whole whistleblowing process basically proves to us that there is a two-tier system that exists. If you are a normal, regular Canadian citizen and you go to your government to complain that, hey, there is wrongdoing happening where you risk your career and your professional reputation, they don't even do anything about it. You know, this whole farce that we were disgruntled and there was some sort of coercion with all of this happening, none of that's actually true because we were patient. How does a fact-finding take 7 months? That's factually incorrect, and they know it because that turned into an investigation by June, and they continue to do it. And what I find disgusting about this is that they continue to deny even the most basic level of truth. When you talk about whistleblowing, they never protected anyone, so everyone that went to ISED as it relates to this, the thing that they were definitive about was you are not going to be protected from the federal government if anything happens from the backlash that the SDTC executives or board members would have to these employees.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today, sir. You know, before I got into elected office, I've worked for a few different companies, and I've seen a different managerial culture, and certainly it falls on a great spectrum. And at times, you know, poor management can be a result of the individuals that are there. At other times, it can be a result because the general culture or ecosystem is poor. So if you don't have strong processes in place, it can allow bad people to do bad things. Whereas if you have good processes in place, at least you can ensure that those people are following the rules. Now, I did note in your opening statement you have talked about the great work that SDTC has done. You do think it's a valuable enterprise, and that you know, with some changes, it should be able to continue doing that great work. But when you were talking about the toxic work culture that exists there, I was just wondering, could you go into a little bit more detail on that? Like, I'm trying to understand, was that a result of the fact that there were bad people there, or was it bad processes, or was it bad people and bad processes that allowed this to fester?
It's both. Yeah. And the reason for that is the bad people don't let the processes come into existence. So, you know, several of the HR people that were all subsequently fired tried to bring in processes. What happens at SDTC, which was, again, founded in the RCGT report that no processes exist, they used to exist. Everything has gone downhill since Leah Lawrence started. It was a slow burn, but that's what happened. And when I talk about this, you know, it's sort of like you get rid of all of the executives one by one. Then you start hiring personal friends in those executive positions. then those personal friends start hiring other personal friends into all of these different organizations and all of these different parts of that organization. So it's taken a long time to get to the point that we're at, but this is where it's gotten to, because there's never been any accountability for anyone at SDTC, because even at the board level, one of the things I want to point out in terms of the gross level of corruption and governance issues that exist, Simon Kennedy came here and talked about how at the board level, only 7 out of the 15 appointees are GIC. The other 8, which a lot of them are on the HR committees of SDTC, they are appointed by what's called a member committee or a member council, which is also the SDTC Act that says that the public interest is represented by these member committees, which are a group of 15 people that are the ones that appoint the other 8, which is the majority of the board. For the last 4 or 5 years, that committee is down to only 2 people, one of which is SDTC's own internal lawyer, Ed Vandenberg. So for the last 5 years, 2 people have been appointing the majority of the board through a basically illegal process. So it's not just that, there's governance issues at the bottom, it's also at the top, and the people that are being brought in even at the board are personal friends of the CEO and other people, because no one is doing a single level of oversight across this. And again, even this issue was brought up to ISED, and they've understood it, but they've chosen not to act, even though legitimately this is someone or a group of people that are breaking the law, because how is it that you're allowing people who've illegally been appointed to the board of SDTC, who are then making decisions on taxpayer dollars in the millions every single day?
I want to get into some very specific things. In your testimony, your opening, you said you worked on the financial analysis of proposals, grant proposals through all of the funds. And you had mentioned the Annette Vacherian Center, which is in Nova Scotia, Annette Vacherian being the chair of this board. You said that Annette Vacherian and the Vacherian Center applied for funds, I think it is, from the Ecosystem Fund. Is that correct?
Correct. And
that application, you were involved with some of your colleagues in analyzing it?
Yeah.
The Ecosystem Fund doesn't support directly green technology companies, does it?
No, SDTC's mandate is to directly fund clean technologies versus what the Ecosystem Fund has been designated by the board is to fund indirectly companies or organizations that help clean technology companies.
And the Vacherian Center in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia is not a clean tech company, is that correct?
No, it's not.
Okay. So what year did that application or process happen?
The application was initiated sometime in the summer of 2021. And what I want to point out as it relates to that application is the Ecosystem Fund is not a publicly available fund. SDTC needs, as part of their contribution agreement, you have to provide everyone the equal opportunity to apply to funding agreements and to apply to any of these funds. For the Ecosystem Fund, that never existed, so it was brought to us by the executives to say, we are now looking at the Vacherian Center.
Did you have any concerns, or did any of the employees have any concerns that funding a center, an ego project of the chair might be a conflict?
There were emails that were sent and by multiple employees.
Who were they sent to?
Executives at SDTC.
Do you have copies of those?
I do.
Would you table those with the committee?
I do.
Thank you. And so when you went through the analysis, what was the state of the Annette Vacherian Center at Cape Breton University at the time, financially?
It would likely go bankrupt if it didn't receive federal funding.
And how much was the chair seeking for her ego project from the Green Slush Fund?
$2.2 million.
Wow, $2.2 million. And so when that process, was the chair ever inquiring as to the state of the process and how it was going?
Yes, she indirectly emailed the executives or other parts of the organization to check in on the progress of the application.
So she was directly involved in trying to push it forward with management.
Absolutely.
And what was the conclusion that the analysis from the team that went to the board said about whether or not it should be funded?
It was recommended for funding
It was. Why was it recommended for funding?
because that's how the organization works. The level of due diligence at SDTC is extremely high, but the ultimate authority on whether projects move forward to the project review committee is held by executives.
So the approving body ultimately is the board itself. Is that right?
The ultimate approving body, but before it goes to the board, it has to go to the project review committee. But before it goes to the project review committee, it has to be agreed upon by the executives.
Okay, so the project review committee reviewed this?
And rejected it based on the conflict of interest, but they still were in favor of it for its technical.
So when it was rejected, were there any commitments that were made to the board chair as to what employees would do after that rejection?
Yeah, they're all included in the board minutes of the project review committee meeting where it was clearly stated that SDTC employees would help the Verscheren Center and move that application into other sources of funding.
So can you table those minutes with the committee?
Yes.
So let me get this straight. The project review committee employees were told after SDTC rejected Annette Verscherian's $2.2 million request to fund her own center, then employees were told that you had to go to work to help Annette Verscherian find that money somewhere else in the government?
Using SDTC's reputation. And just for everyone's reference, SDTC rejects applications all the time, and it references other organizations if they're not a fit. There's an unprecedented time here where employees were asked to go and use that SDTC reputation to go to other places.
And did they do that?
They did.
A lot of the focus that I've seen so far in this meeting has been about, what is the executive branch of government going to be doing? So in other words, like we've just had the deputy minister and his assistants here talking about, what they're going to do internally, but that's all in the executive branch. And I want to focus my question more on like what can the legislative branch do? I think you're seeing part of that in action right now through a parliamentary committee investigating this issue, issuing a report with recommendations. But, when you've been detailing all of the problems as you've experienced them and you are in touch with other employees. But just looking at the legislative authorization that SDTC gets through the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act, say that quickly 5 times. Do you think that there is another role for the legislative branch in looking at stronger legislative guardrails? Have you ever thought about that part of the question, and would you have any recommendations for this committee to look at?
Yeah, like when we're talking about the SDTC Act or that legislation, one of the issues that we found is it seems like no one is actually keeping organizations in compliance as it relates to that. So the Act exists, and when I'm mentioning these member committee people that are illegally being appointed to the board, we still don't know who has authority over overseeing that issue. And it's still not being addressed, even though that's a serious issue of governance at SDTC. Now, there are obvious rules that already exist for, let's say, board members. I can read off anything within the federal government's ethics policy where what they say is governance council employees are required to perform their duties in the public interest. Their personal and professional conduct must be beyond reproach. I don't think anyone here can actually say that the conduct that's been done by the SDTC board is beyond reproach. And on top of that, there's also other language within that agreement that says public office holders have an obligation to perform their official duties and arrange their private affairs in a manner that will bear the closest public scrutiny, an obligation that is not fully discharged by simply acting within the law. And that's the other thing. A lot of the board members and executives come here and say they've done everything right because they talk to their own lawyer. That's not good enough when this is taxpayer dollars, and there's clear language across multiple acts, across multiple policies that the federal government has that clearly show that everything that's done up to now by the executives and board members doesn't even meet that minimum threshold. So I think the issue is, even if there's more language that exists, who's going to actually enforce this?
Is there missing context related to the bonuses and the COVID payments that you can provide us with?
Yes. So I think one of the things that the committee needs to understand about the COVID payments, isn't just that there were conflict of interest rules that were broken. Both of these payments were done within days of the end of fiscal year 2020 and 2021, and in both times, the amount of money that was sent out made a significant impact on the bonuses that executives get. So when on one side, board members are getting all of their companies and all of the information, they're getting all of this funding on one side, and by approving this funding where they've broken conflict of interest rules, they're then also giving bonuses to all of the executives that were the ones that presented that information to the board members.
Okay.
On top of that, the other issue is, for the second COVID payment, it's not just that it was a COVID situation. By 2021, SDTC's board in the fall of 2020 had already agreed that they were not going to do any blanket payments like they had already done. That was in the board presentation, which we can again table, and SDTC even did a full survey of the total portfolio of SDTC companies, which showed that on average, every single company had over 14 months of runway, which is more than enough that you don't need any funding. And instead, the board was presented with another COVID payment, where they then agreed to. And in this case, the board members are coming here saying that the companies were desperate, they needed it, and it was a requirement. That's absolutely false. The companies didn't need it, and the executives chose to give it to everyone.
I have 30 seconds remaining before I turn my time over. The minister said he continuously received evidence. Is that correct?
He did.
And was Simon Kennedy aware of the plan outlined by Mr. McConaughey in May, and was he at those briefings?
He was, and he spoke to him directly on multiple occasions in May and June.
And is that contrary to the testimony that he gave today?
It is.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Question up front. Will you table, it'll be public on the website as evidence, the 30 hours of tapes that you did with the CFO, I said, as well as the pertinent documents?
We will table all the information required.
I'd like to explore one thing on the COVID payments. You said that they weren't all supposed to get the same amount, which is the excuse that's used for voting themselves $3.7 million over 2 meetings. Why was that? Why wouldn't they give them to everybody?
I can't say for certain because I don't know how the executives thought about it, but what happened in that second COVID payment isn't just that everyone got 5%. There was a secondary decision made where certain companies that were the most financially successful were suddenly given 10%. So what they continue to state is that the second COVID payment was again made as it pertains to companies and the whole portfolio of STTC that was having issues with financing and issues with COVID. But what actually was happening was they had information that clearly showed companies had long enough runways that no financing was required, and yet they then created a new criteria that gave them an additional 10% instead of the 5% that everyone had, which included board member companies.
Companies like MindSense, which Andre Lee's Meteau has a financial interest in, that got 10%.
Correct.
So did the team do an analysis of these companies of whether or not they actually needed any COVID relief cash?
There was analysis done on both the funding requirements, but even more, there was also analysis done, which the executives wanted employees to do, which was related to the contribution agreement, because by this point, there were enough federal programs that existed that companies were actually being overfunded to the point where they were breaking the eligibility of what their funding requirements are.
So as an example, MindSense, which got 10% bump up, at the time of the analysis, I think had 100 months of cash available, so they didn't actually need any cash to get through COVID.
They didn't.
And there are other companies like that as well that directors have a financial interest in, that have excess cash but still yet got cash?
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we done?